Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Nationals 2026 Public Forum topic discussion hosted by the Dog of War Debate. Tonight, we're going to cover multiple aspects of this resolution, including arguments, framework, the history, background, international relations, how to adapt to judges and the national tournament, and so much more. So sit back, relax, and if you have any questions, let's please hold those. You can drop those into the chat. You will have certain points during the speech where you can ask those out loud. And so let's begin. The resolution that we will be debating at Nationals this year is resolved. The United States is justified in using force to remove authoritarian leaders from power. So that is going to be the focus of the next hour and 15 minutes or so of this presentation. So this presentation is brought to you by Dog of War Debate. We are a multi-service organization that offers educational support, coaching, and resources for debate teams, debate students, and coaches. So please look us up if you have any further questions. Furthermore, I'd like to give a shout out to my cohort, Mr. Joe Rankin of Bettendorf High School. He is the coach there. Mr. Rankin has a ton of experience with teams at Nationals. He has numerous dozens throughout the last 21 years of coaching, including several teams that have placed in the late elim rounds at Nationals in multiple events, including Public Forum. So he will be manning the chat tonight and answering any questions that you might have in between our Q&A segments. So please don't be afraid to drop a question in. So just to let you know, so Nationals, we did a data count from Nationals last year, and Nationals over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years has been pretty consistent. So the data that we are showing is probably what we're going to see this year. Last year there were 288 not students but teams from 222 schools that started round 1 in Public Forum. Out of those, 71 teams from 62 schools advanced to round 7, and round 7 is the critical kind of the first choke point. Round 7, once you cross over, that means that essentially you have broken at the tournament. You've made elimination rounds. So that's kind of the critical filter. And from that point on, the debates the field keeps getting thinner. At the beginning of the tournament, 351 judges from 263 schools started. Notice there is a disparity in the numbers between numbers of teams entered or schools entered versus the number of judges from schools, because some schools had judges that were in other events that were moved to PF in order to help fill the quota. So what does this mean for you? There's going to be a wide variety of competition and judges. You are going to see a lot of people from parts of the country that you honestly may never have gone to, seen other people from. Because this is a national tournament, you're going to see people that have a variety of experience, whether that be first year freshman who managed to qualify out of the district, or a debater who's in their senior year who has been debating for 6 or 7 years through middle school, has debated widely on the Tournament of Champions circuit, the TOC circuit, and is at Nationals. You're going to see a variety of judges. Unlike other tournaments, maybe like the larger TOC level tournaments, at Nationals, judging tends to be more what we would call lay, or tends to be more judges who perfectly, understand current events, understand what's going on in the world, but may have very little experience judging. These tend to be parents that are brought in because schools need judging for Nationals, and a parent is ever so kind in saying, "Hey, I'm gonna join. I'm gonna come with you all." There are no judge preferences or strikes at this tournament. So some tournaments you go to, you're allowed, let's say you're going to one of the University of Kentucky tournaments. In PF, you're allowed, let's say, 10 strikes, where you could go through and say, out of all of the judges, you are allowed to say, I don't want this judge judging me, or this judge, or this judge. Or if you're in Lincoln Douglas, you're allowed to say, I'm going to rate that judge as a B, that judge as a C, that judge is definitely my A. At Nationals, it's a dice roll, so it's whatever tab room says when they click the button. When you see this, your judge, you can look up paradigms like you would on any other tournament that's hosted on tab room. But because a lot of these judges are going to be lay or parent judges, only about half of the judges from last year actually had paradigms entered. And some of those paradigms were as detailed as, hi, I'm a brand new parent and I'm judging for my student. That I kid you not, those are some of the paradigms that you would see. So really, you're not given a whole lot of information on how to adapt. One of the key things at nationals is the adaptation factor. So you could get very lucky if you're a circuit debater and you get into a tournament and you get 12 circuit judges in your draw. That has happened. You could also get into a tournament, into the tournament, and realize that you have 10 parent judges. The idea thing is to adapt. The idea thing is to remember that at the end of the day, you have to go with what is going to be able to catch the most judges. So doing things that you would see maybe at the Tournament of Champions, knowing that the judge pool is probably 60 or 70% parent or lay judges may not be the best strategy for you. Okay. Speed reading is not going to be the best strategy for you. Using, firing volleys of evidence out there like you're playing paintball is not going to be the best strategy in a lot of cases. A lot of cases, it's going to be more methodical, more strategic, more debate based on the quality of your evidence rather than the quantity. So one good card is going to trump 10 kind of average cards. This is the type of debate tournament where being able to explain your arguments is going to be better than kind of ramming through 10 different arguments at the same time. The way judging works at nationals is that in your prelim rounds, you're going to have 2 judges in each round, and there are 6 prelims, which means that you have 12 judges total. Once you get to round 7, you will have 3 judges, so it'll be the traditional panel that you would see. Once you get semifinals, you'll have 5 judges within your panel. And once you get to the final round, you're going to have 9 judges. And I can tell you from my experience working in tab room at nationals, once you get into later elims, the tab room staff is using a judge list that has been provided from the judge pool room and the NSDA. So we're mainly looking for things like regional diversity. So, for instance, we try to avoid putting 10 or putting 3 Texas judges out of 5 onto a panel. We try to vary it around so that there's an even mix of states, between males and females, between other factors that play in. We try to make sure that it's varied so that the panels are neutral. Everyone is guaranteed 6 prelim rounds over the first 2 days of the tournament. You will advance to elim rounds by earning 8 or more ballots. So there is a case where in a round, one judge could say, "I vote for you." The other judge says, "I vote for your opponents." The key thing is not being able to win rounds or to sweep rounds. The key thing that you're looking for is being able to win 6 ballots. So you can split a couple rounds, but for the most part, you need to close out at least, based on my math, you need to close out 3 of your rounds. So you need to get both judges in those, and then you can split 2 more rounds. Round 7, once you enter round 7, it is now double elim. So round 7, you debate until you have 2 losses or until you win the national title. Considerations that you really want to take into effect when you're going through. The first is that you want to read paradigms. Again, as we talked about before, there are varying degrees of how useful some of these paradigms can be. But the key thing is to read, and that can really help you. Once that, if you're reading through and you find that it's a parent judge or they don't have a paradigm, don't be afraid to ask before the round starts, "Hey, how do you evaluate this argument?" Or "How would you evaluate speed?" Or "How do you do with, this, X, Y, and Z different things?" It never hurts to ask. The other thing that I like to do that has really worked well for my students is to maybe and this might sound a little creepy at first, but it has pragmatic value, is doing a Google search or a LinkedIn search for your judge. See if they have a LinkedIn or some sort of like open social media to learn a little bit about them. What's their background? What do they do for, what is their job? Where do they live? What can you tell about them? Because that can help kind of, phrase how certain arguments are run. That can tell you kind of like, where they're coming from. So on this topic, if you notice that they have a degree in history or a degree in political science or international relations, you know that maybe then that they are a little bit more versed on the topic, so maybe you don't need to go as quite as in depth as other judges. If you notice that they are an experienced parent judge, you know that you could probably go and move up into the category of what my students like to call a flay judge, somewhere between a lay judge and a very experienced circuit judge. But just do a quick search. It lets you know a little bit about them. It allows you to know, it allows you to kind of help shape your arguments. Um, Write multiple cases for both sides. And I know that we are kind of getting into a little bit of the crunch time. We're sitting at about a month away from NATS, and I know lots of you will be wanting to run practice rounds. But writing a couple cases, writing different arguments for different styles, writing cases with, or at least writing modular cases where you can sub out main points can be very useful. There are some schools that have multiple teams at nationals, but not as many as you would see it at a regular local tournament or a NAT circuit tournament. But being able to swap it in and out based upon who you're debating as well as who your judge is can really be useful. Adapt to the best of your ability. Again, at the end of the day, I treat it kind of like you're aiming for the middle ground within the round. So one way I look at it is that if you have a circuit judge and a more parenty judge, doing things that are more circuity in the round in terms of style, you might very well win the circuit judge, but you might lose the parent judge. However, if you do things that are more closer to like a lay style of, that focuses more on presentation, you may very well win both. So at the end of the day, kind of aim for the middle of the round in terms of the judging criteria, and you'll probably be a lot happier. So there's going to be a lot of variance. So, and again, if you have any questions, we will answer these at the very end of our presentation today once we move into Q&A. So the first thing I always like to do is looking at the key terms of the resolution, and this topic in particular has a lot of wiggle room, and it is a lot of fun for those of you out there that like to debate definitions. I was a T debater when I was debating policy, so I like to debate the nitty-gritty terms. So I would be having a field day on this topic. So the United States really is kind of the most straightforward wording in the resolution. It refers to the federal government acting as the foreign policy and military institutions. So it is basically our government. Justified has a lot of different branches. You have both the morality, the legality, and ethically speaking, in terms of warrants. So it is the central evaluating term. So whether you take a moral, a legal, or an ethical approach can change the debate greatly, and it can allow you to claim or to put the debate back on grounds and footing that you are more comfortable on, while putting your opponent kind of on the back foot. Use of force generally is defined as military or armed coercive action. So things like airstrikes, invasions, armed support. And authoritarian leaders, rulers maintaining power through suppression, centralized authority, and limited freedoms. The key thing about these, and we're going to analyze some of these next, is that every key term that I've just talked about is wrong, or at least contestable. Wrong meaning contestable. Every wording, every phrase, every definition I've just told you is pretty much up for debate. The United States is probably the most stable thing that we've got in the resolution. So let's look at how we can play with our definitions and really leverage those to the best of your ability. So first, authoritarian, you could either argue very, very broad or very narrow definitions. So first, if you have a more narrow version of what is an authoritarian leader, if you could say doing this by shutting down the press, by destroying the right for free speech, by taking away elections, especially if you can say, like was done in Iran, like was done in Venezuela, like is being done in China, like what is being done in Cuba. If you could point to specific examples and say that leader is authoritarian because of X, Y, and Z, it favors the affirmative. Affirmative on this topic kind of wants to be narrow because it doesn't want to leave the negative open for their standard route of argumentation saying this resolution is so large it allows us to be the world police. Likewise, if you use a more broad definition on the negative, that opens your ground. That allows you to say, listen, it's authoritarian is an arbitrary. Here's the definition. Here's it's being used contextually by other academics. This basically means the United States could go after any leader because we could classify them as authoritarian based on a whim. So how far do we go? Who gets to decide this category? If it's decided by the current leadership, that changes based upon who's in office. Okay, that changes based upon what Congress is willing to authorize. Okay, so there's a lot. So authoritarian leaders is really up in the air. Just being used as justified as the standard, you've got so much that you could do with this. First, you've got you could argue moral or the ethical standpoint. So at what point does it become, are we ethically justified or morally justified in going in? What laws do we have? We're going to talk today about the UN Charter and international law. A consequentialist mindset. Okay, even if we go in, even if it may not be the right thing to do, is it the right thing to do? Okay, so not necessarily is it the most popular opinion at the time, but are we still accomplishing a better goal? This is where framework selection really becomes useful. One thing about definitions, when you're going into these definition debates, knowing that we are dealing with a largely lay judge pool, one thing is that you're going to want to be able to explain how these function and round a little bit deeper. So if you have somebody like Mr. Rankin or myself in the back of the room, you probably don't need to go as in depth as you would versus like a parent or a new judge, because we have been around the block, we have heard this before. So, if you're going to do definitions based on your judging, you probably want to explain a little bit more. Explain what happens if you win the argument. I win this argument. I won the definition of authoritarian, which means that it is a broad category rather than the narrow category they want to believe. So that means that it's arbitrary. That fuels our argument. So you want to be able to explain the link chain and the steps. Likewise, how broad is use of force? This could be anything, even though traditional definitions put it at the use of military force or the use of using power. One thing that you really want to be aware of is that this could include anything like sanctions. It could include blockades. It can include no-fly zones. It can include boycotts. So use of force is a very broad term as well. And again, this goes affirmative if you use a very narrow definition by saying, using military airstrikes and special forces to remove a leader, kind of like what we did in Venezuela, versus the broad spectrum. Everything is available: cyber warfare, drone warfare, sanctions, blockades, kind of what we're doing in Iran. The next thing, and this is where I think a lot of debaters are going to assume the resolution talks about, but it really doesn't. The resolution is about removing a leader from power. It never says what happens next. A lot of teams, I think, are going to go off of the idea that it's regime change. Really, the resolution just talks about removing the person in charge. It never says we have to justify regime change. So one way that you could have something kind of very similar to kind of what we were hoping to go for in Iran with a regime change by taking out their leadership and disabling their military. We were hoping that there would be the uprising and that the regime would be overthrown. We also saw this in Iraq during the 2003 invasion, that we wanted a regime change, versus Venezuela, where the United States goes in, we grab Maduro, and then we leave the existing government behind. We just hope that they put in a less authoritarian leader. So this could allow you to broaden into a large space of arguments, or it could allow you to cut it off and say, listen, you're saying that removing a leader is bad because it allows for a power that allows for all these horrible things that happen when we try to do regime change. The resolution never says we have to defend that. So there's a lot of space that you could play with here that could allow you to kind of, again, tourniquet what your opponents could say. And again, the key comes down to explaining this in detail. If you're going for something like that, it may take 15, 20 seconds of slow, very approachful, very mindful explanation come the summary speech as you go through it. So modern intervention, I actually, and in the topic essay that you will be getting tomorrow morning from this lecture, I wrote probably 5 or 6 pages on the history going back to like the 1400s in terms of like intervention, and then going back to the U.S.'s history. I want to preface this that I'm going to do my best to get this presentation done in the time I allotted. I want you to know that we are cutting a lot out because there are literal majors in college that focus in on this exact same topic. So we are literally cramming 4 years of college education into about an hour and a half. But please read the packet. It has a lot more detail. If you love history or love the background, please read the packet. So modern day intervention, I include modern day anything after World War II. So as a history major, that's kind of when our textbooks take the third, the third split. So the first being pre-Civil War, then Civil War to World War II, World War II on. So in 1953, the United States had our first engagement with Iran. So Moshe Daegu was ousted by the CIA through a series of coups for the Shah. The Shah was the original, I guess, royalty, the original leadership of the country that was reinstalled. They would remain in power till the 1979 revolution. But this was all done based upon the government that existed prior to 1953, going into more of an authoritarian mindset. A parliamentary government that did not have free elections and eventually tried to get rid of elections altogether. You have a government that was starting to repress people that they found stood in their way of the political leaders, and they were overthrown. You have Arbenz was overthrown in Guatemala in 1954. This led to decades of civil conflict, and again, overthrown because they were not only were they becoming an authoritarian, but the United States ruled that their authoritarianism was threatening to the Western sphere of influence. You're going to find a lot of these examples, especially the more modern ones, were done by the United States by covert groups, by the CIA. Chile in 1973. Allende was ousted from power in Chile in 1973, and Pinochet's authority, which led to the new leader, Pinochet, who actually turned out to be a worse authoritarian leader. And finally, you get to the 1980s. You have the United States supporting the Contras in Nicaragua to oust Noriega, which led to the Iran-Contra scandal, which almost sank the Reagan administration. These are primarily some of the main historical examples pre-1990s that, if anything, you're going to want to research to find a little bit about the background, a little bit more about what drove these and what led to it, because each one of them is unique, and each one of them gives both examples of pro versus con arguments. So one thing I would stress is look up all 4 of these and just do a little bit of reading and see what comes out of it. You'll find it actually comes out, even though these are almost 70 years old, that they have a lot of information that they can give you. We have the post-Cold War, and we're going to cover some of these way more in detail, but in 1994, we have the Rwandan issues. The international community, this is one where ethically, we probably would have been incredibly justified going in, but we didn't do anything. In Rwanda, that this led to the Rwandan genocide, that failure to help separate the sides of the war, of the two halves within Rwanda, the internal civil war, led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands. Kosovo, 1999. This is one of the first ones that I remember. I was in 6th, 7th grade at the time. The international community waited until Kosovo coverage was taking over the nightly news, until they could no longer necessarily hide from it. 1994, yeah, it was fairly easy to kind of say we don't see this, because at that time, cable news networks were not necessarily the 24-hour news cycles that they were today. But But in Kosovo in '99, it was hard to ignore it. So eventually, the U.S. did have to get involved, even though for months we knew that the war was happening, we knew that there was a genocide happening. And there has even been a lot written that the United States was drug their feet on getting involved because Bill Clinton was going through an impeachment trial and scandal. So there was definite action there. In 2005, under George W., we get the RTP doctrine, or the right to protect, which basically said that sovereignty is now conditional. That just because you are a leader in a country does not necessarily mean that your sovereignty is absolute, and that the international community will recognize what you're doing and will allow you to keep it internal. That if what you are doing violates humanitarian norms, it violates human rights, we will come in and we will stop you. So with that being said, now is a good time to ask if anyone has any questions. Okay. Seeing none. So here's something to be thinking about, and this is why when a country goes in to remove a leader, why we do it so infrequently, because there are authoritarian leaders that exist today. That is kind of the dumb moment. That, yeah, they exist. In fact, we are allied with a lot of them, which brings up, we'll talk about it later, brings up some hypocrisy in US action, but there are a lot of authoritarian leaders in the world. And the question then becomes, why is it that we don't go in and just remove all of them? And why don't we try to spur for change? Why don't we try to get all these countries with dictators in charge a new breath of life, a new democracy? Well, the main reason is that regime change is hard. And we saw so it involves multiple steps, including removing leaders, preventing a power vacuum. So once a leader is gone, there's going to be others trying to get in. So this is kind of I would call it the Game of Thrones. The minute one leader dies, there was a power vacuum to try to fill in, and who between the warring families. And that just led to more conflict, more death. You have to avoid state collapse. The minute a leader is removed, their country's economy becomes unstable. Their country's trade becomes unstable. Their security becomes unstable. And essentially, at that point, there needs to be a good infrastructure set up by the country or countries that led to the regime change to keep that propped up and to keep it from descending into chaos. And finally, you have to stop insurgency, because no matter who is overthrown or who is taken out, there's always going to be loyalists that still remain and are going to continue fighting. So these are essentially the 4 steps that are necessary in order to prevent during regime change, and they're all incredibly hard. They're all incredibly timely. Nation building takes time. So the average time, based upon going back to Cold War examples, the average time once you oust a leader before the country truly stabilizes and becomes any semblance of a democracy is about 20 years or more. There have been 2 cases in very recent times, so times that, especially for our students in the room, that you would have the most familiarity with: Iraq and Libya, where we had a swift military victory. I'm just going to say it, that if the United States put its mind to it, there are very few conflicts that we couldn't win very quickly. But after that, you have prolonged nation building, stability, economic influx, and the suppression of insurgencies. And you have zero certainty that it's going to work. As we looked at with the examples, especially in Guatemala, especially in Chile, especially in some of the African nations that we've intervened in, there are zero guarantees that once we get a leader in, that either A, they're going to be the leader we want, and that they're going to be a democratic nation, or they don't devolve back into authoritarianism, or B, that once we start backing away, that country just doesn't go back into an authoritarian leadership as it is, that the government is overthrown by the old regime and it takes over. So like I said, Iraq and Libya are a cautionary tale. So Iraq in 2003, you had a rapid military victory, and this is where we get the probably the worst gotcha moment from the George W. Bush administration, where he landed on an aircraft carrier, had a mission accomplished banner, and announced that we had won the war. And then we ended up being in war in Iraq, suffering casualties for another 20 years. Once we won, we had to face insurgencies from Saddam's regime, a power vacuum from ISIS and AQAP, Al Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula. You had violence. You had violence internally. You had violence from warring parties that wanted control. This led to the rise of ISIS. So it devolved into chaos. The United States, at the end of the day, this was a conflict that, for at least for the large part of my high school through college, really shaped my, how I viewed international relations. I lost friends who served in Iraq and who were killed during mortar attacks or during with roadside bombs. So this definitely shaped, people of my age, and I'm 40. Just to put that in, to clarify, I'm 40. It put that in perspective, and that's how we shaped it. Libya in 2011, the U.S. mandated, Gaddafi was the dictator. There was a time in the 80s where Reagan had the chance to remove him from power and just settled for disabling their military. But eventually, during the Arab Spring, Gaddafi was ousted. The state collapsed, and with fragmented militias, his military and government remained fragmented. And to this day, there is still conflict that permeates through Libya. Finally, we get to the most modern case, a case that we all should be very familiar with. We have Venezuela. In Venezuela, we recognize the dual sovereignty posture that the U.S. recognized the opposition leader over Maduro, blurring, and that's who we prefer. That's who we tended to have diplomatic relations with. That blurred the concept of diplomacy and versus delegitimization of the government. That when we're not speaking to Maduro, when we speak favorably of their opponents, that really kind of shapes, the legitimacy of that we see the government. There was escalating pressure. Sanctions tended not to work. Military rhetoric had been signaled for a long time. Regime change really wasn't on the menu for a long, long time. This sanctions and military pressure and military threats have been used going back to the Obama administration, but Trump was really the president that took this that actually took action on it. There was no direct invasion. We sent in Delta Force to grab Maduro with a limited with kind of superior air superiority over the region. One thing to notice, this is a case where we removed Maduro as the leader, but yet we did not push for regime change. We are hoping that the current president, working within the confines of the government that was set up under Maduro, is going to change tune. And so far, it's too early to call, but this is one case where we have had where there has been regime change. And you could argue that Venezuela is one of the few successful cases of modern regime change where we go in, we use military, we take out an authoritarian leader, and so far the country hasn't devolved into civil war. The modern landscape. So there is formal restraint against this. The UN Charter, Article 2, subsection 4, prohibits unilateral regime change. There was a lot of post-Iraq skepticism. Still remains very strong at this time. The idea is that countries do recognize sovereignty. The R2P policy is an unofficial policy that the United States has been promoting. It is not international law. It is not an international treaty. It is not recognized by international bodies. So even though the UN Charter says that unilateral regime change cannot happen, really it's up to whoever can check power. And that's why when especially in modern times when the US has gone in, they go in with multiple countries in order to get around the whole unilateral change. You get some rhetorical openness, especially in modern times. And one thing I want to note is we are going to talk a lot about Trump on this topic. One thing to know is that this never says anything about Trump. that this never says this goes back to US in general. So we could debate this topic now under President Trump. We could have debated it 16 years ago under President Obama. We could debate it in 12 years under President person we don't even want to speculate on. So don't just focus in on the Trump has done this, so it's bad. Trump has done that, so it's bad. I think that a good policy would be to think about the resolution as a historical timeline, going back to saying like, has it been useful in the past? Is it useful now? And what do we see for the future? And just because it may not be useful for now doesn't mean that it won't be useful in the future. Multipolar constraints. So the United States could kind of run around and act as the world police in the Cold War because at the time there were only a couple superpowers in the world, and it could be argued that the one that had the most influence at the time was the United States. Well, we live in a very multipolar world now, where we have Russia and China on the rise, and we have new groups like the BRICS, which are counterbalancing the United States' unipolar world. So now when we go into a country, it's not just how can we do it, what we know we can. It is how will the other countries take it? How will this affect trade? How will this affect the stock market? How will this affect food supplies? So it is really a lot of multipolarism. And tech blurs the lines. It's the old example of from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, was less than 60 years, but yet the weaponry changed so much between the Spanish American War and World War One. You had the developments from cavalry to artillery. So now we've seen another jump. We've got drones, we've got spy ops, we've got proxy forces, we've got cyber war. We've got a whole bunch of things that has really blurred the lines to expand the concept of use of force. So really, we need to be. It's no longer just sending in troops, boots on the ground, launch a couple missiles. It's, do we give, do we give a group that also hates the same leaders we hate a bunch of drones and point them in the right direction? We can see a similar example with what's happening in Iran right now, where Iran has been incredibly accurate with the drones that they were launching on U.S. bases because the Russians were feeding them information, or at least that's the allegation. So really tech blurs lines, tech changes how use of force means. It's no longer just the whole, send in the gray fleet. It is, okay, we're doing things covert. Any questions so far that has come up? Does the board
Just
look good?
one, yeah,
Okay.
just one that Kai had mentioned a little bit earlier is did the U.S. not sanction Venezuela when the new leader? And we did talk a little bit about how after the regime change was done, we lifted sanctions 3 months later, but I didn't know if you wanted to comment.
Yeah, the United States, in this case, the United States uses sanctions kind of as a, kind of like, I'm going to use an example. It's kind of like a Pavlovian training in a way. We have removed a lot of sanctions because it's as a sign of good faith that we're trusting the new government, that we're trying to get them on our side. And this goes to President Trump. We will always threaten that, we could remove you at a drop of, a hat. In fact, I think he's even said like, maybe we'll find a new leader. In this case, sanctions are being used to basically remind us like, listen, you kind of serve at the whim of us, which brings us into one of the downsides of that we're going to talk about a little bit later of uh, of this, regime change or removal of power is that essentially any leader that gets put in is there because the U.S. went in. So is there kind of a, the U.S. standing over the shoulder aspect? So yeah, there is that. I also think I think that things with Venezuela are going to get a lot more interesting as we get closer to nationals. Trump has just announced that he wants to make Venezuela the 51st state. So, granted, if we were to add all the countries that he said he wants to make into states, we would have like 55 now. So, but here's the thing: his rhetoric still matters in terms of he is the leader of the United States, and that helps shape the course of the resolution. But cool. So, um, so Legal tensions. We covered a little bit of this. Article 2, subsection 4 prohibits force against that protects territorial integrity without unilateral force. We have the R2P, which says sovereignty is conditional. And the thing is again, and that there is a gap between these two standards, Article 2 and R2P, that R2P is normative. It's not a binding law. At the end of the day, and this is where the US feels that this is where they kind of maintain R2P as a counter to the Article 2 clause, is that if we want to get a coalition, we usually go through the Security Council. And because of I guess, the minds on the council, the countries that are on the council, that it is very hard to get a resolution passed when it comes to regime change. Because generally, because of the way we're interconnected in the world, it is very hard to get, especially the veto powers on board, namely looking at Russia, China, and the United States. It's hard to get them on board when it comes to regime change. So Russia might want to regime change in, let's say, the Ukraine. The US is going to veto that every day. The United States wants to regime change in Iran, and Russia's going to veto that every day. Okay, Taiwan wants recognition. China's going to veto that every day. So now we get to the morality of the issue. This gets us into Rwanda in '94 and the buildup to Kosovo in '99. We saw what was going on. Granted, it wasn't as prevalent on the news as it was in '94 as it was in '99, but our leaders, the people in charge, knew what was happening. The intelligence, the CIA, international agencies were feeding information into the White House, into Congress, into the war room, and we chose to do nothing. Rwanda in '94. This is going to be a great example of what happens when we choose not to. This is affirmative. Is talking about is that international hesitation allows for mass killings. It allows for the justification. And it allows for this to spill over. It allows for the breakdown of trust in the region. And this has kind of been the defining case for why, especially when there's humanitarian issues at play, why intervention is necessary. And a line from Albert Einstein: the world is a dangerous place, not because of those who will do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. Okay, this goes back to, and again, if we want to go historically, we can look at what happened in World War II. Really, I mean, the United States through Lend-Lease and, military and other military programs, was sending aid and assistance to our European allies. But really, what got the United States spurred on and moved was the fact that we eventually were attacked at Pearl Harbor. And granted, that was the trigger, a trigger that probably was going to break it any day. The fact of the matter is that we turned a blind eye for a long time. So let's get into the concept of frameworks and the actual argumentation. We've talked about the history. We've given you some examples that you could look up that are going to be fascinating to research and read. But let's look at some frameworky things. And framework at nationals and PF, I believe it has a lot of utility. I believe, again, in front of a lay judge, it is going to be very important to explain how framework functions within a round. That is you want to explain that it's the lens through which all impacts are pre-weighed. You want to figure out how to explain that to a judge. But I think they're very important. So I have 5 for the AF and 5 for the neg we'll talk about. So on the AF, I think that a human rights primacy framework is going to be very powerful. Individual dignity supersedes sovereignty, especially when atrocities occur. This is kind of the smack dab, the bullseye. This is where people are going to be going to. They're going to say, look at what happened here. Look at what happened and we did nothing. Look at what happened here and we did nothing. Look at what happened here and how much better life has gotten. This is what we need to do. In fact, this is one, you have to be very careful about how you research and word it, but you could even argue, yes, Iraq was an absolute dumpster fire of international relations and fighting and conflict for 20 years until we left, but was at the end of the day kind of a consequentialist framework. Were things better off in the end? Which kind of leads us into number 2, which is consequentialism. So even if it's not the most popular at the time, even if it's kind of like falling down a set of stairs to get to the end, did the outcomes justify the actions? Were the consequences of what we did it save lives? Did it help the economy? Did it stop a genocide? And did those outweigh all the kind of bumps and bruises we got along the way? You could go straight R2P. I see R2P and I keep wanting to say R2D2. It's I got Star Wars on the brain. R2P. So you want to argue that listen, sovereignty is conditional. That we live in a world where there is going to be bad things happening. That we live in a globalized world. So one country that is disrupting the order of the rest is pulling down on the net, is pulling down on the overall block. And that's hurting everyone else in the world. It's a ripple effect. So intervention is necessary in order to maintain the stability. You got kind of a cosmopolitan look. So you've got the moral obligation crosses borders. So the idea that we've got social contract theory. We're going back a little into LD on this one. You've got social contract theory, which says, our government protects the sovereigns of our country, the people within our borders. But you could extrapolate that to say that we all live on planet Earth. You could go back to the man, his name. There was the pale blue dot speech. The name escapes me now, and it's right on the tip of my tongue. Carl Sagan. The Carl Sagan's pale blue dot speech. And you could say that, listen, we might be citizens of a country, but at the end of the day, we're all like the bigger picture is we're citizens of the world. So our obligations cross borders because at the end of the day, we should care about the suffering of someone that lives in a country that is far away from us. Because at the end of the day, we all breathe the same air and drink the same water and have the same desires for our family and friends. And then you could also talk about the final is the anti-tyranny legitimacy, or kind of like governmental legitimacy is another way to put it. Authoritarian leaders lack legitimate sovereignty. That this goes to social contract framing and kind of the LD-ish stuff, which is talked about in the packet more. But it goes to talk a little bit about how authoritarian leaders who don't serve their people and only seek to serve themselves or their friends or the party that put them in power are not legitimate governments, so thus they have no rights to begin with. That if you're going to kill and maim your own citizens or suppress their rights, you're not a leader to begin with, so yeah, we're going to remove you. Negative frameworks. So you have the concept of sovereignty and non-intervention, the idea that, listen, that leader over there in that country might be an absolute piece of crap, but there is procedure that we can go through. There are diplomatic channels we can work on. We can build coalitions. That this should not be a unilateral action upon the United States. Realistic stability. The idea is that if we go in, even if we're not looking to seek regime change, if we go in and we take out a leader, does that destabilize the country, and how will that destabilize the region? So you've got utilitarian harms minimization. Historic data, this is where the history majors, the history folk out there are going to love this. That historical data, regime change underproduces higher suffering, higher conflict, higher, worse econ, more death, essentially. People are hurt more. So this is, again, where you have to be very careful. You don't want to say, well, that authoritarian leader is a good person. You definitely don't want to maintain that, but you want to say, like, well, you have to weigh the costs and benefits of going in. So that takes a lot of phrasing, because when you initially say it, it leaves a little bit of a kind of a dirty taste in your mouth. Just talking about it kind of makes me feel a little weird, but it is one thing that you could look at. Anti-imperialism, a lot of people, especially if you go a very broad definition of about what authoritarian leaders are, you basically could argue that this is just another imperialist push by the United States, that we're going in, we're putting in leaders that want to side with us, and we're essentially trying to recreate the days of colonialism. Again, it doesn't help that President Trump has said that we want to turn Venezuela into the 51st state. And the precautionary principle, it's high uncertainty, plus catastrophic risk equals the burden on the AF to prove that it's going to be successful. That they have to prove that, listen, if we do this, you need to guarantee that it's going to get the job done. Because if it ends up leading in like Chile with another authoritarian leader, what good did we do? Any questions about AF framework or AF or an egg framework?
There was one just clarifying that, and I did kind of answer this, but your opinion can be weighed in here too, obviously, duh. But they said that isn't cost benefit analysis the inherent framework in PF, and they don't really recall seeing like final rounds running like framework arguments per se. And I just said, yeah, PF defaults to that, but you can't offer something different if you feel it's in the best interest. And I just advocated for making sure that you were clarifying how you're winning the round, because nothing ticks me off as a judge more is when a debate team in the middle of the round says, hey, here's how I'm winning the round, and I've said this from the beginning, when that hasn't actually been the case.
Yeah, that is very true. So that is a great way of looking at it. And yes, the world in PF does default to cost benefit. I think at nationals, this is again goes down to the writing multiple cases, where if you write a case that has a different change in framework, it can be very useful. And yes, teams that make late elim rounds tend to go default more cost benefit. But I do think there have been rounds in the past that have done, I guess, the frameworks are almost built into the argumentation in terms of like they'd use a more critical style affirmative. They do more on like I believe it was a topic from 2 or 3 years ago. It was a case involving women's rights. I believe I want to say it was 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And the framework, it did have an alternate framework, but it was built into the argument. So yeah, there cost benefit tends to be default, but it is still used at Nats. My teams have done very successfully with it. But this again goes to having the ability to swap it in and out and have different styles of cases or different modular cases can be kind of just another tool within the Swiss Army knife. So cases for intervention. So preventing mass atrocity is going to be, that is kind of that is the driver out of the bag. That's, the shot down the middle of the fairway. Genocide, ethnic cleansings, the, big ones looking at Myanmar or Burma in Southeast Asia, looking at kind of what's going on, what's happened in the Philippines. That's very much on point. Conditional sovereignty, the RTP or R2P, in terms of authoritarian, they lack full legitimacy. Democratic transitions, and this is where you'd want to maybe use some evidence from Diamond. So Larry Diamond is a political scientist who has written a lot about democracies and how they're just kind of the best thing since sliced bread. There's a card, I believe it's Diamond in 95 or Diamond in 98, which talks about how democracies don't go to war with each other. Now, there are some flaws with the evidence, that's for darn sure. But it is a good piece of evidence that says that, like, when you have a true democracy, they tend to be more judicial in their use of force. So you could argue that, which is ironic considering we're talking about a democracy using force. But I would use Larry Diamond if I was talking about democratic transition and democratic promotion. Could be very, very useful. You have deterrence and moral responsibility, so deterrence logic, that you could argue that credible threats of intervention alters authoritarian incentives structures. So even having the threat that you might be overthrown tends to curb authoritarian leadership. That tends to kind of make them play ball. You also have the asymmetric capacity. Greater power equals greater moral obligation. So we're going back to the Uncle Ben Spider-Man theory of with great power comes great responsibility. That this is, and I believe, I can't remember what movie this was a line in, but it's the idea that what's the point in having power if you don't use it? In this case, it's Iron Man. It was Iron Man 1. But if we have great power, if we have the ability basically to take out the majority of world leaders in very short time, which the US does, our military does possess, we have the greater obligation that when it comes time to use this power, that we need to. That when there's a Rwanda, we need to stop it when the deaths and killings are in, the dozens or hundreds before they reach into the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. The case against intervention. So you've got structural instability. Regime removal dismantles governments. It causes instability. It means that, especially in a chaotic region, and this is where it's important to think about what regions of the world are we most likely to be concerned about. So we're no South America, Middle East, Africa tend to be and Southeast Asia tend to be the ones that pop up most often. Knowing that those regions tend to be a little less stable than other regions, if we pull out one of the dominoes that's been holding it together, even if it's an authoritarian leader, does that cause other things to break? Sovereignty is a stabilizer. It erodes non-intervention policy and empowers all powerful states. So the point is, if the United States does this, what then stops Russia or China from saying, hey, we don't like this leader that we're calling authoritarian, let's go oust them. So you could argue that this was essentially the case when Putin went into the Ukraine to get rid of Zelensky. You could argue that there are less destructive alternatives. Now, again, plans and counter plans are not allowed in PF, but you could, if you have, this is where I like to go with what does the solvency say? What do the cards say? If you have a piece of evidence that says no, military intervention is absolutely sucks, there are other alternatives. You can say that you could say there are other non-violent or less destructive alternatives and justify those without reading a counter plan. If the evidence justifies it, you essentially get a pseudo counterplan without getting a counterplan. You've got selective morality and civilian harm. You get the hypocrisy, and this brings us into the concept of basically the hypocrisy problem. The United States, especially in the Cold War, we were allies with authoritarian leaders to oust authoritarian leaders. We know exactly the kinds of horrible things that Stalin was doing in Russia, but he was the lesser of two evils when it came to Hitler. Okay, we knew that some of the leaders we were putting into power in Iran and in Chile and in other Nicaragua, we knew that they would probably be just as bad, but at least they'd be bad that we could at least work with. It's hypocrisy. And so are we really showing? And so one is what we're going, if we're going to put in another authoritarian leader, is it A, being morally right? And two, are we causing civilian harm in the process? So how rounds are won and lost, and this is I think impact weighing, and this is just my personal little thought. I think that impact weighing has kind of vanished from debate, and I think I kind of want to bring it back. So I wanted to cover a little bit how you could weigh impacts. So on magnitude, you've got genocide level harms justifies a risk. You've got historical examples when it's like, what are your harms on genocide? Well, how about 300,000 in Rwanda, or 500,000 in the Congo, or what about those? Neg, you want to balance magnitude with probability of failure. Yeah, we might be stopping a genocide now, but will that lead to more deaths over time? Time frame, that ongoing atrocities are happening right now. So the time frame is, you maybe want to phrase it, the minute you vote is essentially the action time, but because genocides are happening now, atrocities are happening now. So the time frame is immediate versus long run instability, long run destabilization, long run civil war. Again, when we go in, especially with the way the US has gone in before, it generally lasts 20 plus years. Reversibility. This is the Dr. House example that death is kind of irreversible. The only thing that death is pretty terminal. Once an atrocity happens, once a genocide happens, even you could even argue that even seeing the horrors of conflict because of these authoritarian leaders is something that is going to damage people, especially children, that they're going to take that with them and have to live with for the rest of their lives. So reversibility, we stop it now, we kind of cut it off. In the neg, reversibility, long-term instability outweighs short-term gains. That at the end of the day, you might be stopped, basically you're going to cause that the cataclysm, that the domino chain that you're setting off now is pretty darn hard to stop. So it's also kind of irreversible. Scope, targeted relief on one population. We're being very narrow on this. Versus scope, regional spillover, world spillover. Remember, we're all globally and interconnected. The deepest clash, things that I think that are going to be very powerful. We've got the deepest clash being the affirmative lens of humanitarian security. I think is going to be a very big, powerful argument. about promoting stopping suffering and ending, atrocities, which means that when you are writing your blocks, you're going to really want to have a good set of blocks on this. Because I would bet, my Magic the Gathering collection that you're going to hear this from every AF team out there that you debate. Negative lens, system stability. You're going to want to argue what happens when there's conflict. You're going to want to argue destabilization, the globalized network being pulled down. You can even see that right now with what we're trying to do in the Middle East with Iran. Even if the Strait of Hormuz was to open up today, it would take us another month and a half or 2 months before things stabilized. And that's assuming that then prices go back down. So you've got system stability versus humanitarian security. And these will be shaped by your framework choices or just straight cost benefit. So my strategic playbook, things that I believe that are the six key factors that are going to help you in the debate, 3 on the AF, 3 on the neg. On the AF, first is prioritizing magnitude. So arguing that you affect the most amount of people. You want to compress the time frame that the harms are ongoing right now. Look at what happened when we didn't go in and look at what happens when we can. And you want to control the definitions. You really want to get a good handle on those. And you really want to win the battle up front in terms of what is authoritarian. Because that allows you to kind of what we would call spike out of a ton of your opponent's arguments in order to be able to say, like, listen, their arguments are based on this broad definition. We're not, we won the definition, or they didn't have a counter definition, which means, their 3 contentions are interesting but irrelevant because those are for broad. On the negative, emphasize probability, that the failed interventions are far more common than not. One we didn't talk about now at this time was Afghanistan. That was another case where, there were I believe historically there were 4 separate attempts to conquer Afghanistan before the U.S. went in. And each one of them lasted for decades when, the warring parties that beat had to withdraw. And you could argue that even though things tend to be stable now, are they really that stable in Afghanistan? Extended time frame, that we can't just look at what's happening now. We have to think about our consequences in the future. This is the whole, if I eat this Big Mac now, yeah, it solves my hunger now, but what's going to happen to me, in a couple hours? Especially, I'm a diabetic, so I have to look at, like, I eat this cake now, it solves my hunger. What happens to my blood sugar in 3 hours? Finally, systemic spillover. So, it erodes norms. It emboldens rival powers to do the same thing. It expands scope beyond just one state into a region. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our Dog of War topic discussion for the Nationals 2026 Public Forum Resolution. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording, and we're going to go into Q&A.